Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zainab Badawi. Members of the international coalition against the so-called Islamic State, including Britain, have been weighing up the effectiveness of airstrikes on IS strongholds inside Syria in the aftermath of the Paris attacks. But what impact has the intensified military campaign against IS had on the Syrian opposition? My guest is Monzer Akbik from the Syrian National Coalition, an umbrella organisation made up of Syrian rebel groups. Does he believe their battle against President Assad has been re-energised or weakened by the targeting of IS? Monzer Akbik, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you for having me.
We've seen the 65-member coalition against ISIL strengthen as a result of the Paris attacks in November. Is that something you welcome?
Well, what I welcome is more attention to what is going on in Syria. It's obviously that there are really very bad guys who are ISIS and Assad. They are still there at large, and they are able to commit atrocities against the Syrian people. So more attention to Syria to solve the humanitarian problem, to achieve some kind of ceasefire, political transition there, is welcomed by us.
More attention, but it's got to be the right attention from your point of view. You say atrocities committed by the Assad regime and ISIS, but I put it to you, actually, that the Syrian people are suffering more as a result of Assad forces. And I just give you a comment made by Noor Kabash, who's a Syrian living in Lebanon, where she works in humanitarian field, and she asked people to imagine what would have happened if what occurred in Paris is happening on a daily basis for 5 years. And she says, now imagine in Syria, imagine all that happening without global sympathy for innocent lost lives, without the support of every world leader condemning the violence. Do you believe there's a bit of a double standard there, that Syrian lives in a way matter less than those killed in the West?
Yeah, somehow I agree to that, and this is unfortunate, actually. There are a lot of countries who have expressed sympathy with the Syrian people, and they have expressed support for the Syrian people to get rid of the dictatorship of Assad. But unfortunately, that support was always short of achieving a decisive end to this war.
But why the double standard, in your view? Why do you think people care less about the 250,000 Syrians who've died as a result, directly or indirectly, of President Bashar al-Assad than those killed in Europe?
Well, it is natural that for the Europeans to have more attention and interest for the things that is happening inside Europe itself. Of course, that those attacks in Paris, they were appalling, and we have condemned them in the Syrian coalition. And we don't want anybody to be harmed anywhere in the world. At the same time, also, we are asking for international attention after nearly 5 years of Syrians losing their lives to broker a solution in Syria.
But you're getting more international attention, but I put it to you, it might be operating to your detriment. I give you one example why I say that. Laurent Fabius, the French foreign minister, told RTL Radio at the end of November that winning back Raqqa, the ISIL stronghold in Syria, was a priority and required bombings and troops on the ground, which could include Free Syrian Army forces, that is the rebel forces, Sunni Arab forces, and why not, he asks, Syrian regime forces. So he's even suggesting there that actually you could go into alliance with President Assad's forces.
No, the French, they have clarified those statements. They said that such participation would be after the transition, means after the end of dictatorship and transition toward a transitional government. Of course, there are many elements that have to be excluded from this. There are the militias and Iranian Revolutionary Guards who are fighting with Assad now. And there are the people who committed crimes against humanity.
He clarified, but he didn't retract the why not Syrian regime forces. He just said within an internationally agreed cooperation framework and so on. So, I mean, the point I'm trying to make to you is 2013, you've got the French saying, we want to take action against Bashar al-Assad's chemical weapons sites. They called him a pariah. And the US and the UK, as we know, backtracked. And yet now you find them kind of, you know, making these kind of statements. It's a very different spirit.
I would say that it's not because it is conditional, that after the transition, I would say that we have already agreed, everybody has agreed to Geneva Communique, which says that the institutions in Syria should be preserved. So should be reformed but preserved. So after the transition, when the dictatorship ends, Assad goes, then the remnants of Syrian army, of course, they will continue normally after excluding the elements, the criminal elements, and they will be united together with the rest of the Syrians to fight terrorism.
We'll talk about the transition and the fact that that is being pursued in the diplomatic track in parallel to the military strategy. But that's a long way off, as we'll discuss later. But all right, let me put to you, Colonel Hassan Mustafa of the 30th Infantry Division, which is a rebel force, says Bashar al-Assad has given the world two options, either Daesh, that's the Arabic for ISIL, or his regime. It seems the world has chosen Bashar al-Assad to support him. So that's the point I'm making. He sees it in the way that I've kind of represented to you.
Well, he is frustrated enough to make this statement. I don't think that the world has chosen Bashar al-Assad. The positions has not changed. But what I notice is that the priority has shifted towards confrontation of ISIS. But we can prove also that unless there is a progress on the political level, unless there is a progress on the front of changing the regime, there will not be a progress also on confrontation of ISIS, because both things are linked together.
Sure, but are you saying that, because, you know, you're not all speaking with one voice, and I know the Syrian National Coalition represents more than 30 blocs, as it were, in the Syrian opposition, but I give you another person within the opposition movement who disagrees with what you're saying. Lieutenant Colonel Faris al-Bayoush, leader of One Free Syrian Army Group, has said, we fight the terrorism of the regime first and then the terrorism of ISIL. So he's actually putting the priorities quite differently from how you've just pictured it. You've said, OK, maybe we have to target ISIL first. He's saying, no, we target the regime first. So which is more important? He
is expressing that because the pressure, the military pressure from the regime side is much more than from the ISIS side. Now, the Free Syrian Army is fighting ISIS since the beginning of 2014, and this fight continues. But there is enormous pressure from the regime, together with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the militias, together with the Russians who came in starting from 30th of September and bombing the rebels. And they are attacking, they are on the offensive everywhere, in the south, in Damascus, in Homs, Hama, the coastal mountains, south of Aleppo. So there is a huge pressure from the regime right now. So that's why it's priority, because these people, they have to defend themselves and they have to defend the people and the villages and the territory they have.
So when I ask you which is more important, just very simply, priorities, because there is a thought that you can't do both at once. As the former British Chief of the Defence Staff General, Sir David Rich, has said, we want to deal with Islamic State, but we also want to get rid of Assad. I don't think that's plausible. Do you think you can do both at the same time?
Both at the same time, it is possible, but you cannot reach a decisive end. You mean you cannot completely eradicate ISIS and have a sustainable campaign that will lead to a complete success unless the danger from the regime and his allies is subsided or end.
So one is not more important than the other?
No, they are both important. The confrontation with ISIS should continue, but you cannot really reach to a final result with ISIS unless you get the first, the most important, of course, the biggest front that is with the regime that has to be some kind of ceasefire or a political solution. Something has to happen there in order for all the people to make a sustainable and successful campaign against ISIS.
All right, so now I ask you, in the context of all this debate we're having, for instance, in the British House of Commons, we've heard the debate there, and we've seen the intensified airstrikes by the Russians, by the French, after the Paris attacks. Basically, it's still trying to get a sense of it for you. Is that good? Is that renewed airstrike, intensified airstrike, is that good for the Syrian opposition?
What is good for the Syrian opposition is that they get support for the Syrian people to end the bloodshed and to end the criminals in Syria who are the regime, Assad regime, and ISIS.
And are airstrikes going to do that?
The airstrikes alone cannot do that. What we have to do is that we have to have boots on the ground. And the boots on the ground are the Free Syrian Army, the rebels. Now, the rebels, they can, and they have before defeated ISIS, and they can defeat ISIS with the support of air force from the allies. But at the same time, they have their hands full now fighting the regime, and the regime is on the offensive everywhere with the Iranian and the Russians. So it is not that ISIS is a priority or the Assad is priority. What we need to do is that we need to have a ceasefire on the regime front first, in order for the rebels to be able to fight ISIS and get rid of ISIS, and I think it will be in a relatively short time.
So you're saying that you have this temporary truce or truce with the government, and that it is the rebel fighters on the ground who will take on ISIL for Syria and the world. Do you think you can do that? So when David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, says he reckons that there are about 70,000 Syrian moderate armed forces on the ground, and he says not all of them are ideal partners, to quote him directly, but 70,000 is the figure he gives. He says there's a further 25,000 troops on the ground, Syrian rebels, but they're not really good partners at all for the coalition. You think that sounds about right?
Yeah, and they are even more than that. You know, what are the Syrian rebels? The Syrian rebels are from the people. They are actually, they did not start the war. The regime started the war on the people because they wanted change, and they held arms in self-defense. These are the Syrian rebels. So it is difficult to define a number because they are basically arising from the society itself. But I think there are more than 100,000.
And do they have everything they need? Because one does wonder why, if they have got this capability that you say they have to take on ISIL, why they've not done that already. I mean, that was a thought that Julian Lewis, the chairman of the UK House of Commons Defence Select Committee, you know, has said. Where are these magical 70,000 people, and why have they been unable to roll back Daesh or ISIL?
No, in terms of hardware, they have been always underarmed, comparing to what the regime has. In terms of why they have not taken ISIS, they have fought. They have been fighting ISIS since about 2 years, and they are continuing to fight ISIS. But also, again, I would have to emphasize that the danger from the regime front is much more higher than ISIS. Now, both ISIS and Assad are killing innocent civilians, but Assad is killing 10 times what ISIS are doing. And Assad is on the offensive all the time against these people. They have to defend their villages, their cities, their families.
So clearly their priority is to fight the force that is killing them in greater numbers, and that is the regime.
Yes.
And that's the point I'm trying to make, which is international attention is now focused on Syria, but more on focusing on ISIL strongholds in Syria and how you can get these divergent views to come together to your benefit.
Well, ISIS is a symptom of the disease, and the disease was that in the very beginning that Assad regime waged a war against the people and effected a collective punishment against the people because the people wanted a change, and they have the right to change. They have the right to call for freedom, dignity, and the change of the regime towards democracy. Now, this is the main problem, and I don't think that ISIS problem could be completely solved unless this problem is solved.
All right, what about the thought that's also been floated by some? Anwar Gargash, the Foreign Minister of the United Arab Emirates, has said that the UAE will send in ground troops to Syria, and he has said that he would back international efforts to set up a regionally led coalition to intervene to fight in Syria. And he said the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen is an alternative model. So is that something that you would welcome? Arab, Muslim troops on the ground in Syria helping you in your fight both against ISIL and possibly the regime, or does it all just become too messy then?
We have welcomed before more intervention from our friends and allies, whether they are the Gulf countries or our friends in the West. Remember when there was the chemical attack in 2013, we have welcomed intervention from the West, but it didn't happen at that time. And of course, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they are our brothers and our allies, and their intervention would be to the benefit and favor of Syrian people.
So that is something that you, as a opposition spokesperson, could say, boots on the ground, because everybody's saying, look, air operations are not enough. The Americans said they'll send in more special operation forces. They've not disclosed the number, but, you know, not proper combat ground troops. You're thinking now that there could be an Arab coalition coming in?
It could be an Arab coalition. In principle, anything that will save Syrian lives and will help Syrians to end this tragedy and this humanitarian suffering, and to help Syrians to get rid of those criminals of ISIS and Assad, anything that will help on that direction and eventually reaching to a democratic state, we will welcome.
And what about Turkey? Because, as you know, Turkey is constantly being pushed by the Americans, the French now particularly, to do more to close its border with Syria, because they say that ISIL fighters are moving in and out of the country. Is that something, what's your view on that? Because, I mean, a lot of the coalition Syrian opposition members are based in Turkey.
What I know is that recently, 10 days ago, there were a few villages north of Aleppo.
In Syria, yeah.
In Syria. They were liberated from ISIS control by the rebels with the help of Turkish Air Force and American drones. So the Turks are already hitting ISIS now, and they are supporting also the same goal of getting rid of both ISIS and Assad.
Because, you know, there is a view, Richard Haas, former American official, who says that Turkey is not the stalwart NATO partner it once was. Today, Turkey is more an ally in name than in fact. Turkey has done little to staunch the flow of foreign recruits to ISIS who cross its territory en route to Syria.
Well, of course, the Turks, they can answer for themselves. The questions could be addressed to a Turkish spokesperson. But for us, we haven't seen any evidence that the Turks are not against ISIS or they are supporting in any way.
All right, so
ISIS.
it's a very mixed picture on the ground. We've got Iranian forces in Syria supporting President Bashar al-Assad, also Lebanese Hezbollah fighters fighting alongside them. You've got the Russians with their airstrikes against both ISIL strongholds as well as on Syrian opposition fighters. So you've got that problem as well from the air. So there's all this that has to be reconciled. So you look at the diplomatic track, the negotiations that have started first in Geneva and now most latterly in Vienna, although Syrians were not invited to that. 20 nations attended those talks recently. That's the only way there's going to be a resolution to what's going on in Syria in the end. You accept that, a political diplomatic solution, not a military one.
What came out of Vienna was somehow encouraging, because for the first time in such a meeting, there was talk about a ceasefire that everybody agrees on, including the P5. And there was talk about a certain time schedule for the transition. Like beginning of the year, there will be negotiations. And then in the mid-2016, the transitional governing body should have been established by then, and then it will rule the country towards an election after 18 months. And the election should be completely supervised and monitored by United Nations. So whatever is written is encouraging, but you have to be cautiously optimistic, because the Russians, they have agreed on a ceasefire, they have agreed on a political solution, but at the same time, what they are doing on the ground, actually more than 95% of their strikes are against moderate rebels and the civilians. So what they are saying is that they came in to confront ISIS or to bomb ISIS. They are not doing that. They are supporting the Assad regime together with the Iranians from the ground, and their actions are completely contradicts with what they are saying. Mm. So what we need to do is to know exactly what are the Russians' intentions. I think what the West need to do is to call their bluff on the ceasefire matter and to go immediately to the Security Council and call for that ceasefire. The Russians can effect a ceasefire if they want it.
You mean to get President Assad? Because, I mean, that's the question mark as well. Would President Assad agree to a ceasefire? Would his forces agree?
If you get the Russians to agree to that, Assad will agree to that. They have enough leverage on Assad, especially after their military intervention, to get him agree to a ceasefire.
Because there is a view. I mean, what about the Iranians? they have a lot of leverage with Bashar al-Assad too. Where do they fit into all this? And arguably, actually, because he's a Shia like them, they're even keener supporters of Bashar al-Assad.
The Iranians also has to agree to a ceasefire because also their troops are on the ground, the Revolutionary Guard. They have about 30,000 troops, 5,000 of them Revolutionary Guard, Iranian, and 25,000 of militias that are connected with Iran or supported by Iran, Hezbollah and Iraqi militias, etc., etc. So these people also, eventually, they have to agree to a ceasefire and they have to leave the country. I mean, we don't want them to remain in the country.
You mention Russia and you say that it can tell Bashar al-Assad to do this, but the fact is, don't you Syrians have to say to the Russians, we will protect your interests? Because, I mean, Russia is very, very wedded to the fact that it has the Tartus and Latakia military bases in Syria, surrounded by Western military bases in the region. And it's thinking, look, we've got these two in Syria. We've traditionally had a good relationship with the Assad regime, be it Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar's father, and so on and so forth. You have to protect Russian interests, don't you?
We have told the Russians several times about this, and we have talked to them about the interests matters. But they always refuse to engage in such dialogue. The problem is that the Russians, they consider...
Apologies for breaking into our programs now. I want to take you to a live...